Everyone. I'm pleased that you're able to join us today. This is part 2 of the webinar regarding Indian law in the nation and in Utah. I need to tell you some housekeeping matters before we get started. First of all, you need to stay on for the full hour in order to get credit, CLE credit, pursuant to the Supreme Court rules. So if for some reason you lose signal and you have to sign back in, if you happen to sign in using a different ID, like your phone number, please email me at lori.nelson@law.utah.edu and tell me your name and your bar number and the phone number that you used, because if I just see a phone number, I don't know who it's linked to. And really, you only have to email me if for some reason you lose signal and you have to sign back on using a different ID. Please, at the end, we will have questions. So please use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature, that we can monitor your questions. If there's a question that you're particularly interested in, you can like that question and it will go to the top. This is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel sometime next week, I anticipate. Now, before we start, and I turn this over to Herm and Heather, we want to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is a traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. This webinar is one of those types of activities that we're trying to do to get more awareness to the general public and also to let the bar know what they can do to help participate. With that, I'm going to now turn the time over to our presenters, Herm Olsen and Heather Tanana. And Herm, why don't you lead us off?
Well, thank you, Lori. I'm delighted to join with you all today. I would like to begin by creating perhaps a little confusion and angst among some of us, which includes this. I was asked a couple of years ago to try and find out the preferred name of the Indian population. And so I looked around, I researched, I checked, and I found that many Indigenous people prefer the word Indian or Indigenous to Native American. They felt that the word Native has negative connotations, and technically they're not Native anyway, they said, having immigrated themselves. Well, I've checked this over the years with many people from many tribes, including the first Indian Deputy Director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the head of the Northwest Shoshone Band of Indians, the Tuba City Area Representative for DNA, Chairman of the Board of the Navajo Legal Services, the Executive Director of DNA, the Utah Denebakea Corporation, the previous Indian Law Section Chair, the Director of American Indian Services, which provides higher education scholarships to Indigenous students. And I also discovered there is a deeply embedded preference within the federal government for the word Indian. Virtually every treaty that the United States government entered into with what the Supreme Court called the domestic dependent nations uses the word Indian. And virtually all of those tribal groups self-identify as Indians. There's the Indian Education Assistance Program, the Indian Self-Determination Act, the Indian Reorganization Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act and Indian Gaming Regulation Act. So I'm just saying, I don't know with what you're comfortable, but understand that probably whatever choice you make in terms of that decision will be reflected by some group of these different tribal entities. You know, sometimes in order to understand issues of today, it's good to know the history of things. And so I'd like to present, and Lori, at this point, if you can start doing screen share, some pictures that I took down on the reservation, the Navajo reservation, back in the late 1960s, and share with you what they represent and how they are applicable today. This first picture, as you can see, is simply an old dirt road among the trackless area of the checkerboard area in northwestern New Mexico. This happens to be in the Tanana area. You know, I was driving around one day and was so thrilled to see a tree. I took a picture of it. And someone asked me, well, is that a dead tree, a live tree? I don't know, but it was a tree, and I thought noteworthy. This is a tent, as you can see. I took this picture on a bitter, cold January morning where it was about 0 degrees. And this little family group was living in a tent, for crying out loud. If you look at the corner of the tent, you can see a 55-gallon drum, which was their water supply, which, by the way, was frozen solid. This shows a couple of things I want you to look at. One is that branched covering, that's called the tache, which is the shaded covering where the Navajo women will cook in the summertime because it will be under the shade and a little bit cooler, allowing themselves to enjoy any breeze that might occur. But behind that, you'll see a hogan, which is an 8-sided octagonal traditional dwelling where the door always faces to the east. This is the Montoya Bagan complex, and you can see right where that rainbow is hitting is a traditional hogan, and off to the right are a couple of small structures. Back in the 1950s and the 1960s, the government became embarrassed that so many of its citizens were still living in traditional dwellings. And so they created what was called the HITP program, Home Improvement Training Program. And thousands of these little square-shaped shacks were built right next to hogans so that the government could then confirm that people were living on, not on dirt floored hogans, but on wooden floored little houses. This is one of those HITP houses. I've actually lived in both an HITP house and a hogan, and I can affirm that the hogans are substantially better structures to live in. Warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer. And one of the hardest places I ever had to live was in a little HITP house like that. I think I would have preferred the tent. This is May Jim weaving a rug that they're able to do just from memory. They know these patterns, they weave them. First, of course, the little kids of the area will herd the sheep. they'll shear the sheep, they'll card the wool, and then create the yarn from the carded wool, and then dye the yarn in different colors. And that's what you're seeing here, is different colored yarns being woven into a rug, which was an important employment source for primarily the women. The women would then take those rugs that, they would make on average, 20, 25 cents an hour weaving these rugs to the trading post. This happens to be the Denebito trading post in Arizona. Women would bring their rugs here, sell them to the trader. He'd mark them up and try and sell them to whomever he could. The men on the reservation really had a hard time with employment. They loved basketball, but that's a hard career path to be professional. They loved rodeo, which is what this guy is doing. Same thing, not much money there. And so for the most part, the men would leave the reservation and back in the 60s go to work for the railroad. So they'd be gone months and months and months at a time working for the railroad. This is a sweet little old lady named Rosita Woody in the yellow blouse, her grandson, and her mother. And they lived in a hogan out in the Pueblo Alto area. This is another lady I knew, and she is caretaker to her mother, who's lying there on the ground. And you can see the rather copious pharmacological access she has. There's an Alka-Seltzer, Vicks Vapor Rub, Robitussin, and a box of Kleenex. And she's taking care of her mother. As it turns out, her mother died that very next day. But that's part of the healthcare system that was existent then. Now, this is not Navajo, this is Hopi. The Hopis live in villages, and the Navajo are they're far more fluid in their living arrangements, but this is in Old Aribe, in the heart of the Hopi reservation. One of the things we want to talk about are problems facing the indigenous people today. And this is a picture or a copy of the Tribune I made 11 years ago, discussing the toxic legacy we have left on Indian lands. And the Navajo, it includes uranium tailings, strip mine waste, deep mine lung disease, oil spills, and abandoned clutter throughout the reservation. So, and that's going on today, and we're just not cleaning it up very well. So the rape, ruin, and run corporations are still at it today, impacting the lives of our Native people. Okay, Lori, I think that was all. Now, to discuss some of the issues for today that face us, I want to just check and make sure I'm not taking too long. I want to talk about issues that are of contemporary concern. I spoke yesterday with the chapter president for Torreon, New Mexico, in the checkerboard area. And just to let you know what the checkerboard area is, there is this very complex land ownership system in northwestern New Mexico, at least, where a large part of the reservation is. One section is owned by the Navajo tribe. The next section is owned by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The next section is owned by the New Mexico state government. The next section is owned by private people. And so if an offense gets committed, the police don't rush out to investigate the offense, they rush to the surveyor's office to see on whose land it occurred so they can turn it over to whatever agency is appropriate. And it gets rather confusing, but Torreon is part of this checkerboard area. And I asked Rochelle Montoya what she perceived as to be the most dominant issues among the reservation people and especially the youth today. Number one, substance abuse. That includes alcohol, vaping, drugs, but mostly alcohol. And interestingly enough, sometimes people are surprised, alcohol theoretically is strictly forbidden on the reservation. That's why clever businessmen surveyed, and literally immediately across the line of the reservation, they'll build a bar. She and I both knew of the one in her area called Penistaje, which I had to drag some friends out of on a regular basis. But cheap liquor and border bars are a serious problem on the reservation, and they have been for generations. A second issue, limited opportunities, no jobs. It's hard to get employment on the reservation, so people move off, and that really tends to disrupt family situations. Kids graduating from high school can join the military. They can try and move on to higher education or go get a job off reservation on the railroad again. Infrastructure, and you saw some of the infrastructure problems with those photos that I showed, that being housing that has running water and electricity. In Blanding, Utah, right across the ravine from where a beautiful museum built by Utah State University is tribal land and multiple mobile homes, but there isn't a single water connection to any of them from the city of Blanding. So these are still ongoing issues, which include broadband access. In today's world of internet and Zoom communications, if you're not connected, you have a hard time dealing with life. So as a consequence, suicide, especially among the youth, is a pretty serious problem. The Navajo Legal Services is the public defender for the reservation, and it stands in Navajo for Denebbe'inat Nahilnat Be'agadit Ahi. That's what DNA stands for. But since that's a mouthful, most people just say DNA. But DNA is the legal services arm, which services not only the Navajo, but Hopi, Hualapai, the Kaibab Paiute, Supai, and others, other Indian groups down on in the Arizona, New Mexico area and Utah. We have a tribal court in Anath, Utah, run by the Navajo Nation, and the DNA appears there. DNA processes about 1,500 to 2,000 cases a year. I spoke with their executive director, the DNA executive director, and I'm on the board of directors, have been for about 25 years. And he confirms that family issues are the number one problem on the reservation, with alcohol playing a dominant role, housing issues, and consumer law issues, which include predatory contracts by border merchants that sometimes take advantage of the tribal members. So, the sad thing is that the same thing we're facing today is what we were facing 55, 60 years ago. It is a slow fix, a slow problem to deal with. But there is a part of that reservation experience that embeds into your heart and makes you want to say, I know there are problems. I'd like to be part of a solution, which is in part why I've remained involved for years and years and years. So while there are problems, I'm now going to turn the time over to Heather, who will tell us all of the magic solutions that she has. So Heather, go ahead.
Thanks, Herm. And I don't know that I've all the solutions, but I thought I'd go a little bit into some different areas in the work that I've been doing. So hey, everyone, really happy to be here. I'm a research professor at the law school. So I'm of European descent on my mother's side, and my father's side, my clans are the Towering House and Blackstreet Woods people. What a great series we have. So a couple weeks ago, the dean and one of our great tribal leaders, Darren Perry, and our Utah Division of Indian Affairs director, Dusty Jansen, did a presentation, and they went over this past. And if you weren't able to catch that, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel. We have it recorded because it's so important that you educate yourself about the past history with tribal communities to understand the issues that they're facing. And so what they had discussed a couple weeks ago was going over the federal policies. Anyway, they went over these eras, and what I like to also highlight based on my work is over the same time period in our medical field and in the research, there were very specific actions taken with tribal communities to take from them to advance medical research, but again, without an understanding of the communities they were working with, without really working with them and gaining their consent. So an example here, like this tarsectomy, trachoma is an infectious eye disease. That was a really serious health threat back in 1897. And doctors went about treating that in American Indian communities by surgically removing the upper and lower eyelids of men, women, and children. And that was a really radical operation at the time. They didn't check the results, determine whether that was more successful, and it was not widely used in other populations. And then the Air Force in the 1950s exposed Alaska Natives, again, men, women, elders, children, to radiation without their consent to do some thyroid research. And in the 70s, Indian Health Services, the agency that was set up to provide healthcare to Native Americans in the US based on treaty and trust responsibilities, physicians in these clinics were sterilizing Native women without their consent. And then our classic, Google this if you haven't heard of it, is the Havasupai study that occurred in the 90s when Arizona State University went into the Havasupai tribe to conduct a study on diabetes. The tribe was facing really high rates of diabetes. Blood samples were collected. And then the university and researchers used those samples, the DNA information, for other studies that the tribal members had not consented to, and things that really conflicted with their cultural and traditional values, like looking into migration studies of where ancestors came and schizophrenia and inbreeding. So, if I really encourage you, Google search, go to the library. This history is just so important to be able to grasp why historical trauma exists today, why all of these different actions have really crippled tribal communities. So the slides that Herm was showing earlier, it's understandable how communities got to where they are today, why there's lack of infrastructure, why they were taken advantage of, why we have lower graduation rates, why, and across the field, it's not just our legal profession, but Native Americans represent the smallest group, right? 1 to 3% are attorneys, same with physicians, same with teachers. It's because of these actions. How can tribes recover? How can these communities thrive when they've been beaten down for decades, past 200 years? So again, encourage you to learn more, listen to that last presentation if you did not, because understanding that history, understanding the actions is just so critical when we're trying to work with tribal communities and to assess, because there's a lot of really goodwill out there, right? And I really hope the attorneys that are on this are willing to volunteer their time and help out our urban population here. We have an outstanding Utah Legal Services with Bertie Key Lopez and Brian Davis, who are the two kind of Native community attorneys, and they're always looking for assistance. But before you go and do that, make sure you take the time to educate yourself. So what I want to do in just, next 10 minutes here, so we can have time for discussion, is just hit on a couple big challenges that we're dealing with right now. And I want to also highlight, what are tribal responses and how can you help for each of these different areas? There was a U.S. Commission of Civil Rights report, I want to say 2019, that did a really great job of going through the different federal responsibilities to tribes today and highlighting all of the areas and ways that the federal government has failed to uphold its promises, to uphold its treaty and trust responsibilities. And these are kind of some of the big takeaways there. It talks about the limited health resources that Indian Health Service, again, agency established to provide healthcare, but historically has been severely underfunded. Their clinics are old and outdated. They do not have enough professional staff to provide the services that they need to. The infrastructure that exists out in tribal communities, many can be very limited. I know during COVID, right, they really highlighted the fact that Navajo Nation reservation the size of West Virginia has about 13 grocery stores. I think there's 13 grocery stores within 10 miles of me, right? And so just think of the challenges that's going to present. And then this ongoing difficulty as well to engage in effective and adequate consultation with tribals. Those are kind of some very high-level challenges they've been dealing with. And as a result of this past and kind of failure of the government, honestly, it's not surprising that some tribal communities were hit so hard by COVID. Navajo in particular, White Mountain Apache, some of our Eastern Cherokee tribes out east, because they lacked that infrastructure, they lacked the health services. If you had a positive case, down in Monument Valley, there wasn't a ventilator down there. They had to send you off to another hospital if you had a real serious case. So a lot of real challenges. And Navajo participated in one of the Pfizer studies, which is good, right? If you're doing familiar with kind of research, and it's a mandate, right, with federally funded research that you include diverse population groups, because we want to make sure that one treatment works across all different treatment groups. There are some situations where health providers, depending on the population group they're doing with, right, they adjust what the treatment is. But the response to Navajo's participation in the COVID studies, right, wasn't positive from the community at the beginning. Again, because of these past actions by the research community, by the federal government, there's a lot of mistrust. So I just put this slide up there to emphasize that this mistrust today is understandable, absolutely. And it's something that anyone who is from outside of the community trying to work with Native populations today, you're going to be dealing with this. And I think the burden is on you a little bit to overcome it. So one of the big contributors to the high COVID incidence rates was lack of water access in Native American homes. And Dig Deep and US Water Alliance came out with this report that identified race as the #1 predictor of water and sanitation access in homes. And while Black and Latinx community or households are 2 times less likely to have plumbing in their homes, piped water delivery, Native Americans are 19 times. I mean, oh my goodness. And that what's amazing about that is, right, a lot of people think, well, oh, tribal communities, they're in very rural locations. Sometimes that can be challenging. This finding was nationwide. And we also know that most Native Americans, about 50% plus, are actually living in urban communities. And so it accounted for rural locations, it accounted for household income, and it was still race that was the #1 predictor. And so we have some real challenges here, given that water is so essential to public health. It's necessary for economic growth in communities for them to thrive. And again, kind of COVID has really shined a light on this challenge. Navajo Nation, look at that, of how many homes lack. So it's understandable why that community was so hit by COVID. Many households have to haul their water very long distances, and it's much more expensive. And so if you're curious about learning about this more, I encourage you to go to tribalcleanwater.org. I've been involved in a universal access to clean water initiative with the Water and Tribes Initiative to really bring light on this challenge. And what I'm showing you here is the Indian Health Service. They have a sanitation facilities construction program, and they track homes. Now, this is not all inclusive. They don't have a mandate to go out and do surveys, but when tribes contact them and tell them about a home that might lack access, then they'll go and look at it, fill it in their database. But you can see the red, these are different degrees of deficiencies, that light yellow being the lowest level of deficiency in a home, and the red being the highest, that there is no piped water coming into that home. So Alaska, huge challenge, as well as our Four Corners area. And in response to this, and as part of our initiative, it's been really amazing to see tribal leaders testifying before Congress. Senator Bennett in Colorado has been a huge supporter of these efforts. He's introduced a bill into Congress that was going to fully fund the primary agencies that are involved in drinking water projects. Part of that got included in the infrastructure bill. Fingers crossed will get passed and signed someday in the near future. But again, tribal leaders have known about these challenges forever, and they're pushing, and their communities are pushing on the federal government to do something about it. So I encourage you on the waterfront, contact your representative, and let's get these bills passed and these agencies funded. Okay, I also have to do a shout out to the Power Act, because I love our Utah Federal District Court here. And the Power Act, it was a funky law that was passed a couple years ago, putting the task to the federal courts to hold these events about domestic violence. And so, as you see here, right, domestic violence is certainly a problem nationally, and there are a lot of costs associated with it. And research has shown that legal representation can lead to better outcomes and, more protected borders, and women and men being protected against domestic violence. For tribal, native, whether it's tribal, urban, or American Indians and Alaska Native women, the rates are higher. And so what, Herm said about the case filings, domestic matters, family law cases are a very high percentage of the cases that the courts are dealing with, both in tribal court. Now, for those that don't know, right, Navajo Nation has its own tribal courts. Our Ute Indian tribe out in the Uinta Basin also has its tribal court, as well as Goshute. The other 5 courts or 5 nations in Utah do not. And so, you know, if you are down in, say, Montezuma Creek, right, you'd have that option of helping someone to file in tribal court or in the state court. And if there's questions about that, we can talk about that later and kind of if there's interest of where you file. But this is an area where I think attorneys can really help out with family law cases and protective orders. And I think Navajo actually also just came out with kind of like a bench book for protective orders and things like that. So there's resources. If you want to help, the need is there. And again, whether it's through our Indian law section, Bertie and Brian at Utah Legal Services, we are happy to kind of help you if you haven't practiced family law before. There are a lot of attorneys and we have such a great community here that we can help guide you through that process. But definitely needed. And then just in this couple minutes, the last couple challenges I want to highlight is the voting. So I don't know if people read about, we had some recent issues down in San Juan County with the commissioner election and things like that. And there have been, not just here in Utah, but nationally, right? We knew North Dakota requiring the photo ID law that got challenged and eventually got settled, part of it. Because of, again, some of the rural nature of tribal communities, this is a particular issue out on the reservations. Homes don't have house numbers. They don't even have street numbers. And so I encourage you to go to ruralutahproject.org if this is an area that you're interested, as well as our local ACLU, because ACLU, they're always looking for poll monitors. When the San Juan County elections went on, they were looking for poll monitors. I'll tell you, I went down there and myself and other volunteers, we definitely observed some incorrect information being provided out. And so we want to make sure that all of our community members, all of our Utah residents, native, non-native, you're aware of what your rights are and things like that. And Rural Utah Project has been doing a great job partnering with Google to go out and actually give the coordination addresses to folks. My parents moved down to Monument Valley, gosh, over 10 years ago. And when they moved there, the clinic provides some trailers. My father was a physician at UNHS clinic down there, and there was no address. My mom was wanting to order things, from Amazon. So she went and wrote her own sign, number 1, stuck it on the house, and then made up, medical drive address and would just kind of put in the notes. And it worked for a little while. Now they've got a little street sign, but the challenges out there are real on the physical location, ordering things, which can lead to difficulty with voting and also making sure, right? Sometimes we have some of our elders may not be very fluent in English. And sometimes when you're speaking Navajo, right, saying yes, no, there's a lot of opportunity for confusion and misunderstanding when we're dealing with first language English speakers. And so that's another area where we want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to engage in the voting process, because it's so connected to everything else, right? Protecting our environmental rights, all of these other things. Your vote is so powerful. So the last thing real fast, because I know, again, the hour just flies by, is that I want to hit on is the Indian Child Welfare Act. So today we annually, we hold the Utah Indian Child Welfare Act conference. And we had some great speakers this morning which again, if you missed part of that or want to listen to it later, it should be available online at some later point. But Native American children were being removed from their homes at rates far, far exceeding other groups. And in the 60s, this became a real concern to the community and tribal leaders. And many people banded together to testify to Congress to raise up these issues so that ultimately the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978. And what the act requires, which I should note many have called the gold standard for not just adoptions or removals involving Indian children, but the gold standard for any abuse, neglect, dependency, proceeding, and adoption, that it should really apply to all children. But anyway, the law, just quick recap, it just imposes some additional requirements on state courts and state agencies when they remove a child from their family and are placing them into foster care and then ultimately through adoption. And the law has been challenged many times, but for the first time, this most recent case, the Brackeen case, the Fifth Circuit found that some provisions of the law violate, whether commandeering or different, anyway, for various reasons. It's a very long opinion. And if you go to organizations like NCA, National Congress of American Indians, or the National Indian Child Welfare Association, they'll provide this, kind of summaries of the case in much more detail. And then my favorite is, if you're on a drive, listen to the This Land podcast, because this whole season is about ICWA and about following the case. And it's really worth your time, because on the surface, when most people look at the case, they're thinking like, oh, this is just about Native children, but it's about much more. It's about challenging the status of tribes as political entities, identity of Native Americans as a citizen of Navajo Nation. That political distinction is why we can, if you dismantle that and it is viewed as just a racial distinction, then it can dismantle have much broader implications for the rest of federal Indian law. And so many tribes, are filing this. Many amicus briefs are being filed. Our Utah AG has signed on to one in support of ICWA. So this is one area where I'd say, aside from just kind of supporting the legal efforts, again, I think our state has recognized the importance of it, but if you're outside state, what are they doing in support or not? Contact them. But the cases, there's also an opportunity here to help out on the actual cases. A lot of, they're in many Native American homes. It's not just mom and dad who are rearing the kids, but aunties there, grandmas there as well. And so when a kid gets removed, a lot of times in my experience, what I've seen is that there is a family member wanting to care for the child, but they're having difficulty getting that placement. And so there's opportunities to help represent family members in these cases, as well, of course, the parents themselves. So those are just a couple, we could really go on for much longer, but I just wanted to highlight those few areas of some challenges that we're facing, and then I want to make sure there's time for discussion too. Okay, yay.
Great. Thank you, guys. There is one comment, and I know I'm not going to say this properly, so I'd appreciate if you guys help my pronunciation. The branch covered pavilion is probably better called a chahash-o or chaha-o.
Okay.
Tachi is something else entirely.
Mhm.
So
Thank you, Raymond.
help me with that.
No, that's fine. I concede the point.
Oh, okay. Joseph Russ asks, hi, Joseph, by the way. Did the monies obtained for the Ute tribe in the 1950s lawsuit brought by Ernest Wilkinson help or hurt the tribe? Go, Herm.
I've got a thought on that. I appreciate that question, Joseph. I lived on the reservation in 1969, 70, 71. then again as an attorney for the Navajo tribe in 76 and 7. But I lived at one point, I lived in Shiprock and knew a young man who was just graduating from high school. And on his 18th birthday, he traveled up to Utah. He was Navajo, lived on the Navajo reservation, spoke Navajo. To my knowledge, didn't speak a word of Ute, but he was either half or quarter Ute. So he enrolled not as a Navajo, but as a Ute, so he could qualify for a $10,000 cash payment, which for a kid right out of high school in 1969 was a big deal. Kind of a big deal today, but $10,000 was huge. So he went up. He got his check from that settlement that Joseph asks about and came back to Shiprock. And within 3 weeks, the money was gone. He bought a new car that broke down. He bought a set of weights that sat out in the rain and rusted. And the rest was simply spent. He had a wonderful 3 weeks, but the money was gone. So helpful, that's a darn good question. In some ways, I'm sure it was. Probably some people were far more wise with the use of that money. I just know anecdotally in my own observation, some were not. So helpful, yes, I hope, and no, not particularly, except for a wonderful 3-week binge.
So Herm, let me expound on that a little bit, because I think that experience would be true of any teenager, right?
Oh, yeah.
Just wouldn't understand and appreciate the value. So can you please sort of give us some background on that money and what it was for and why it was given?
Well, to the extent I can, the Navajo have adopted a practice whereby monies that the tribe gets from internal reservation resources, the royalties from Peabody coal, royalties from oil and gas. You know, back in the 1860s, when I think the Anglo world looked around and saw some of what appeared to them to be the most godforsaken territory left in the United States, they said, oh, that's good for the Hopi, that's good for the Navajo. And, you know, the laugh is on them because it ended up being rich in uranium resources, coal, oil and gas, some timber. And so the Navajo nation uses those royalty monies back into the general fund for distribution for various tribal programs. I'm not sure, but I believe the Ute tribe utilized a different method. And they said, we'll take that money and distribute it not as a collective benefit, but an individual benefit. And that's why tribal members were allowed to receive a cash stipend when they turned 18. Yeah. And so that's a different concept of how to utilize tribal resource money.
Yeah, so I haven't read like the big history of that case in particular. My understanding is it was related to like land compensation that the federal government had to pay out. And I don't know, you know, the tribe got over like $30 million from it. And I don't know that any of this, I don't know if it's out there. I'd be surprised if the Ute tribe published, here's how this money was distributed or what it went to. I'm not aware of anything like that, but again, I haven't dived into it deeply. But what I will say is that tribes are allowed to do what Herm was talking about, these per capita payments to tribal members, but they're not able to do that unless they go through certain steps first, and they have to show that they're providing kind of like these public services. But once they establish that they're doing that, then they are allowed to do these per capita payments. Navajo Nation does not provide them. Not all tribes do. Some, like you Indian tribe, do give those payments. And I don't know that there's been formal research on the tribes that do and do not to really say definitively whether it's harmful or not. It's really just anecdotal at this point. But I think, you know, what is not, you know, you Indian tribe was not as affected by COVID-19. I think they did a really good response, and I suspect that they're kind of more having those funds available from their natural development made it easier for them to support their tribal communities and to get services out there. So, you know, drawbacks and benefits both ways, but I know their cases, you know, they had a couple out there, but they were not nearly as impacted as some of our other tribal communities here in Utah.
So is there a disparity in water access? No, sorry. Is the disparity in water access a racial issue, or does it have more to do with the systemic problems in getting water to reservations? In other words, was the disparity the same for Native populations living off reservation or in urban areas?
Yeah, that 19 times was a national looking at urban and reservation. And again, more Native Americans are living off reservation than on. So that factor what the report did looked at it nationally. Now, certainly, I think why is that the way? Why is it 19 times? Which, if you look at Navajo Nation specifically, there's 67 times more likely to lack plumbing. Why is that a problem? It's definitely rooted in systemic racism for sure. So race is the greatest impactor, but the contributing factors to it, because I guarantee if you dig into kind of their data, you'll see that the Latinx, the Black communities, these Native populations, those individuals in urban settings who do not lack pipe water, right, is because of where they're located, and that it's built in with these kind of structural racism and our environmental justice kind of areas that have resulted from the challenges that you're mentioning in your comment, for sure.
So someone asked a question about part 1 of this, and I posted the link under the answer tab, and it's on the Law School's YouTube channel. John Call asks, what is the status of the Navajo power plant outside of Page?
You know, that's a good question. The last I heard, it's at risk of closing down, period. It has gotten its coal historically from the Peabody coal mine on Black Mesa in northern Arizona. I actually lived on the southern end of Black Mesa in the Denebito area at one point. Massive open pit coal mine that had a slurry line from the coal mine itself all the way over to Page. But coal-fired plants are sort of on the blacklist socially and culturally now, because they're such terribly high pollutant emission problems. And so not only the coal-fired plant at Page, but also the coal-fired plant just outside of Shiprock, New Mexico, are both slated for closure, I believe. They're closing down the mine. And I think the plant, unless it transitions to natural gas, I'm afraid nobody wants to buy power from a coal-fired plant because of the black mark in terms of climate change issues. So I think it's got serious problems for the future.
Okay, thanks. Raymond Wixom asks, Indian voters had a significant impact on the results of the 2020 elections in Arizona and elsewhere. An observer could conclude that some members of the Arizona legislature and other legislatures would prefer that Indian voters have less impact in future elections. Does either speaker have knowledge of what efforts are being made to make sure that Indian voters are registered and able to cast votes that are counted in future elections?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of work's been done on that, and you're absolutely right. There's some like voter maps in Arizona that have identified how the indigenous kind of vote came out and really had an impact. And that's where I point again to that Rural Utah Project is one of the biggest groups that I'm aware of in Utah, and ACLU who are on the ground working to make sure people are registered. I think Rural Utah Project in particular is really great because they have tribal members on their staff. They have individuals who are fluent in Navajo to be able to have a greater on the ground impact. And anyway, so I think it's something that groups like that are aware of, and they are still very active right now and engaged in that work. So if you're near Utah, Rural Utah Project's a really great organization.
And can I say, Lori, can I just make one addendum? Because I think we're probably, are we close to wrapping up?
We're good. Keep talking.
I just wanted to throw in a little historical insight. I worked for a congressman from Utah from 1976 to 1980 in Washington, D.C., who was, and that was Gun McKay. He was a member of the Interior Appropriations Committee, and he was serving when the Indian Child Welfare Act was proposed. And so my job was to get some Indian tribal leaders back to Washington to speak to the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we had a multiple of tribal members, not only Navajo, but Ute and Hopi and Zuni tribal members come and speak in favor of passage of that act. And so I was sort of on the ground and in the committee rooms when those issues were discussed, and happily it did pass. Just an historical footnote.
So I'm going to lump three questions in together. And Yolanda Francisco Nez says, it may be critical to note that this type of information misrepresents that Navajo received money from the federal government. So Heather's going to respond to that. Yolanda also says it may be worth mentioning that there is no Navajo law enforcement in areas of Utah Navajo. That makes it difficult for domestic violence, sexual abuse victims, and abducted Navajo to receive a police response. She also says, and I think this is really an interesting fact, can you buy or own land on the Navajo Nation? No, the Navajo people are on trust land owned by the federal government. It's, I didn't know that. I thought that was their land, and it isn't. Yeah. And she also says, can an alleged non-Navajo perpetrator be prosecuted for a felony? If not, why not?
Yeah, a lot of stuff there, and we'll try and get through quickly. And absolutely great comment, because there's so many misconceptions out there about money and tax paying for Native Americans. Native Americans pay taxes. A lot of people think they don't pay any federal taxes. They absolutely do. Unless you solely work and live on the reservation, you're also paying state taxes. So, and the money that comes, right, there's no money from the federal government directly to Native Americans. Money that's going to tribes is often exactly the same type of money that's going to state and local governments. It's through an agency grant program, or like COVID relief dollars. Yes, money went out to tribe for COVID relief dollars, but it also went out to a lot of other groups as well. So there isn't like this special pocket of money that tribes are suddenly getting. And, and exactly, even that lawsuit, the settlement before was based off a lawsuit, same way any other kind of groups would get funding through a lawsuit. So yeah, a lot of misconceptions in that area. I'm trying to just look at the list real quick. What did you say? Law enforcement is tricky. So Utah has with the state has like because the DV issues also relate a little bit to the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement as well, right? And so Utah has started like a task force group on this. There was also a lot of movement on this pre-COVID, and I'm hoping water infrastructure got a lot of attention on COVID, and I worry that it's a little bit kind of made us lose our focus on the DV and missing and murdered Indigenous women. But there is a task force with the state of Utah. The federal government and their Department of Justice also has initiatives to address missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so hopefully that will help with the cross-jurisdictional and enforcement issues. But absolutely, Yolanda, it's difficult right now and room for improvement. I'm hoping last time they went over the land status at the last issue, but yeah, any tribe can purchase land and own it in fee, but that's not reservation land. And there's a process for putting fee land into trust land. And that's a whole other area I don't think I have time for. And yeah, non-Navajo perpetrator can be prosecuted for a felony, and that's why we have our wonderful U.S. attorneys, though. And again, kind of complicated issue to do a quick crim law thing, but the challenge there is if you're on tribal reservations and you're dealing with these felony crimes, right? There's limitations, generally speaking, on the tribe to be able to prosecute a non-native for a felony because those fall under the Major Crimes Act. And so we have to bring in the FBI now to investigate it. We have to get the U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute it. So yes, we can deal with these, but it's more challenging. And that's maybe we can get you, if people are interested, we can maybe post some more learning resources about these topics.
Okay, one final question. The situation for distribution of proceeds from development of natural resources on the UNO is different and complicated by the termination of a portion of the enrolled membership of the Ute tribe decades ago. So a portion is allocated to the tribe for distribution among enrolled members, and a portion is allocated to the Ute Distribution Corporation for distribution to its members who are the terminated formerly enrolled members or their heirs and successors. So what are your comments on that?
Well, I'm not sure I have any direct response to that. That sounds like it's likely accurate. I would like to comment on a couple of those other points that were raised that Heather addressed. One is, it's my understanding that the Navajo tribe is the owner of the underlying reservation property, and the Navajo tribe is the one that issues allotments to tribal members. So a tribal member doesn't own in fee simple his land, but he applies to the tribe for an allotment area, and the tribe then authorizes or fails to authorize the use of that. So it can remain sort of in family for generations through the allotment process, but I think the Navajo tribe is in charge of the allocation of those allotments. And I think Heather touched on the severe federal crimes investigated by the FBI. They're identified and specific. So an Anglo who gets stopped for speeding on the reservation can certainly be taken to a tribal court and have his issues adjudicated in tribal court. But the serious crimes identified by the federal government, jurisdiction was retained by the U.S. government, prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and investigated by the FBI. So at least that's my understanding.
We have another, one final question. We know that felony crimes occurring on tribal land have a majority of cases not being prosecuted by the federal government. Is there any clear solution to solving that problem?
Money.
Yeah. And I come in, that's right. And there is a report you can pull up that looks at it shows those low rates. It's not just in Utah, it's across the country. But I do think that there are initiatives right now and efforts to improve that. And I think, if you were to contact our folks over at the Utah U.S. Attorney's Office, they're aware of it and they're working to try and do better. But the influx of cases in Oklahoma with the McGirt ruling. I know our local office here, they were helping with that. And so, yeah, it's going to take time because you need more people, more FBI agents, more prosecutors.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll see where the criminal I'm really interested to see where criminal jurisdiction goes in the future. Because I think.
But the political prospect of that is always fairly dim at best because, you know, the high profile urban Anglo prosecutions get a lot more publicity than a felony in a remote corner of a reservation. And it's a tragic reality, but ultimately it has to be resolved, in my view, politically by simply creating a broader economic base for the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for reservation crimes. And that's, you know, good luck with that. It's a hard sell.
So I know I said that was one last question, but this raises to my mind something. And what you've done for me, frankly, is shine a light on something that I really never had that much awareness into. And I'm ashamed of myself to be able to say that. But I know there's been a lot of chatter on the internet about the Gabby Petito case up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and all the attention that got. Now, you know, understandably, her parents were noisy. And they kept going to the press and they kept going to the press.
Yeah.
But it's alarming to me that we don't hear as much or hardly at all about the indigenous people in the continental United States and in Alaska that experience these same kind of crimes. And how can we, people like me, do my part to shine more light on that, because I don't hear about them. So what can we do?
Yeah. I mean, Yolanda, we should be putting on your mic. So Yolanda, who's been having some excellent comments on here, it works at Restoring Ancestral Winds, which is a nonprofit group here in Utah that directly is working on these DV, missing and murdered Indigenous women efforts in Utah. And so if you want to help, I encourage you look at their organization, contribute to their organization, because they are working with the state of Utah. They are working on bringing attention to these issues because there's a real disparity. Lauren, you hit right on it that, you know, some young white woman goes missing and the search is on, and yet this happens every single day to our Native community members. And they're relying on, you know, just these real grassroots.
It is a generational double standard that is painfully, painfully with us. And Lori, I think the best we can do is reach out to our senators and our congressmen and see if they even care.
Well,
put the pressure, make them accountable.
But part of my question is it cultural? I mean, I was raised up by, my dad was in World War II, and I was raised by people who said, you never air your dirty laundry in public. So I was wondering if there was a component of this that is cultural, that says we don't take these matters to the public, we handle them in our community. Or am I wrong about that? Or uninformed, better would be a better way to say it.
I mean, certainly there's some issues. I think if you're dealing with some legal issues like family law in general, divorces and custody disputes, a lot of tribal communities are small and you may not want other people to know your business. But when we're talking about our missing daughters, cousins, nieces, I've seen the calls and they're using the resources they have. They're posting on Facebook, they're posting on Instagram, and the burden shouldn't be on that family member to be putting up flyers.
Right.
In my opinion, you know, and so I think with this particular area, it's not, it's this systemic challenge we have of ignoring our communities of color and prioritizing our white communities.
Yeah, so but if it's not a cultural issue, then I wouldn't feel bad about publicizing it. If it was a cultural issue, I wouldn't want to insert myself into something inappropriately. So it's good to know that that has other reasons beyond being a cultural issue. So I appreciate that. And for those of you that are still on, you can look in the Q&A. Yolanda posted some web links, and I would encourage you to look at those and do what I am going to do and what this has helped me learn about, and that is become more educated on these issues so we really can be proactive and effective in the efforts that we make. So thank you to both of you. I could keep talking all day long, but I think that we need to end because we're losing our audience members. But I really, really am so grateful for the prior panel and for you to shine a light on these issues for us and to really let us know how we can help. So thank you both very, very much. And thanks to all of you that attended and participated. We appreciated your comments. And Raymond, thank you. This was really a gripping presentation.